our Culture Connection speaker series, where we are talking with Americans in different fields of work who share their interest and knowledge in Russian arts, society, culture, and history. We'll see how American attitudes and tastes have changed over the years and how Americans are connecting on a cultural level with Russia. My name is Michael Beckelheimer, and I'm joining you from Washington, D.C. This program is presented by the American Center of Moscow, which is supported by the American Embassy in Moscow. If you are watching on the American Center's YouTube, VK, or Telegram channels, please post comments and questions. We love questions. You can ask about anything at any time. And for Russian subtitles, please select closed captioning in Russian so you can follow along. So, Carol, today we'll be talking to Dr. Carol Apollonio, who has taught Russian literature at Duke University for 40 years. She's a specialist in Russian literature, Russian and Japanese translation, and language pedagogy. She has been an interpreter for the US government in nuclear weapons negotiations, among other things. Her most recent books are Simply Chekhov, Chekhov's Letters, and some translations of contemporary Russian writing, including Elisa Ganeva's novels, Offended Sensibilities, Bride and Groom, and The Mountain and the Wall. Carol served as president of the International Dostoevsky Society for 4 years and continues on their board as honorary president. And that's how we met. Her advice for you in times of trouble: take a break and read a little Chekhov or a lot of Tolstoy. So Carol, welcome to the series. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
One of the wonderful things about having you as a guest is there are a million different things we can talk about. Originally, we were going to focus on contemporary Russian writers, but so much has been happening with Chekhov and Dostoevsky in your world. And we haven't really had a chance to properly discuss your journey across Siberia to follow in Chekhov's steps. That we're going to focus on that today. But again, to the audience, there are many topics that Carol knows a lot about and has had very interesting experiences in. So please feel free to ask. And Carol, can we start with a softball question, if you will? Although all of these are going to be easy for you. Can you tell us a little about your background and what stands out to you when you think about who you are and what you've done? And how did you come to Russia?
Oh my gosh. You know, it's funny. People, it's like a point of entry, you know, to your life story, really. And people come to their stories from any number of different points of entry. And for me, I guess it was the language mostly. And actually, English language and reading English literature and reading, English and even writing. So for me, languages were the point of entry. And then I grew up during the Cold War, so I always thought, well, what they really need is somebody who can just speak the language and everything will be fine, So that was my 18-year-old self. And I have been lucky enough to be able to build a life story based on my engagement with actually Russian language, but also English through translation and, other languages that come up. So I would say that's the main theme that unites all these crazy different things I've had the good luck to do during my lifetime. And Russian literature, of course. I mean, once you're in there, I don't think you can get out. I'm still trapped in Russian literature. And I'm okay with that because it's also a way of escaping, weirdly enough, right? You get in the book and it gives you some perspective and comfort and something to think about. So yeah, I think it's language and then literature. Of course, the connections you build, like these that we're having today with people who share your interest in great books.
Great. That comment about escape, it's so relevant. When I was doing research on Pushkin, when I was in St. Petersburg, people there would say they could escape, with Pushkin and sort of get out of the everyday, realities and just dive into their literature. But you are a specialist in Dostoevsky and Chekhov. And from what I understand, this is because at Duke University, you were asked to teach Dostoevsky and Chekhov. So is that how you came to those two great authors? And what do they mean to you?
It certainly is why I specialize in them. Of course, I did go to graduate school, and if you can't get a graduate degree in Russian literature without reading all of these great writers, and so I was ready when asked. It's like the soldier waiting for the commanding officer to say, go out and go out into battle with the books. So that's kind of what happened. I was ready, I was poised, but it was really through teaching, and I think you can ask any teacher this. It's when you teach that you really start to learn. You really start to learn about these books. I can't help it. I reread them every time. I keep saying, no, I'll just, deploy what I did last time. But they're so good, and it's such a good way to spend time to get in those books. I'm teaching a monograph course right now on the Brothers Karamazov. I've never done that. So we get to spend the whole semester just not grazing really, just feasting, I guess, in the novel itself and in its context. So it never ends, and it's like, I guess, fine wine. The more you read it, the better it is. It kind of ages. And so I don't know what your question was, but I hope I answered.
Well, now I've already moved on to another question. I'm jealous of these students of yours who get to spend an entire semester reading and diving into Brothers Karamazov. You're a translator. What translation are you going to ask them to read?
Well, that's not a softball question, by the way. There are 8 translations of the Brothers Karamazov. That's actually fewer than there are of Crime and Punishment. There's at least 13 of those. Oh, I'm just talking about English too.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So what I do, and again, this develops over time, the more you read, the more you understand how each word carries a lot of different nuances in each sentence, in each paragraph, and each novel. And so I am not strident at all about not wanting my students to read this or that translation. I actually want to have a lot of translations in play. Normally, I don't really even recommend a particular translation for students. I just say, everybody get what they can, make sure it's not abridged, make sure it's a credited translator, and then that becomes a focus of our conversations in class. I'm really committed to this because I think it's kind of a mistake to think there is a perfect translation. It's not a perfect art. It's not like, mathematics. I hope I'm not offending any mathematician. Math is hard, but you found the answer with math, right? You set yourself a problem, you want the answer. But in the humanities, that's not true. The more you read, the more confused you get, which I think is good, and the more receptive to other people's thoughts. So that's true for translation too. And so even though I have a class of 27 now, so we all are using one basic version of the novel, which is Constance Garnett's revised version by Susan McReynolds Otto in the Norton series. And that's good because it's been a long time since I've done that. And so I can just tell the students, open to page 120, instead of saying, okay, let's go to book 3 and find the paragraph. So it's more efficient, but in a certain way, kind of less rich because we do a lot of reading aloud. So I'll have a student read aloud from one translation and everybody else is listening in their own different ones. And always the exciting conversations come out of that. They'll say, well, my translator didn't say that. And it's not that one translator is wrong. It's just that this translator was focusing on a different nuance in that reading that the translation is doing. So this is kind of my campaign, I guess. I'm a translator. I believe I like to do good work, but I don't think that my work is excluding everybody else who also have a different take on the language. It's a living thing. Literature is, and translation is a living thing, and it's a conversation. So that was. We can talk about that for a long time, but I bet you have some other things you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, I like that. Every different translation is a contribution. What about your students? You've been working with students for 4 decades. How do they respond to Russian literature today? Has that changed at all? Has it evolved? Have their interests or tastes changed?
That too is just such a great question because this literature goes on and on. It's all of this is from, I teach 19th century literature, and people keep reading it, despite the fact that this is a different country, a different preoccupations, and so on. So my students, and basically all readers, I think, they're going to change. They're going to bring a different kind of sensibility to their reading. The main thing to me then is to get them to do the reading. That's what I think. That's what I consider my main job. And so I just say, this class will mean nothing to you unless you actually read text. I don't go in and lecture so much. So I quiz my students every day. Watching today, and I hope you thank me for this, students, because I quiz them every day to make sure they do the reading. So then everybody comes and we've all read it and can have a real conversation, instead of them going, okay, I didn't read it, so you tell me what I'm supposed to think. Obviously, over this past few generations of students, their preoccupations have changed, their interests. Nowadays, when my students, we're reading, of course, Dostoevsky right now, and they get very triggered by some of the scenes that involve women, particularly when there's a teenage woman, and an older man, which is pretty much happens a lot in Dostoevsky. So that kind of conversation tends to be fairly new to me now. I think people are more sensitive to that kind of theme. But what we try and do is, acknowledge that and see how it affects them, what they're reading affects their way of being in the world, and how it might be a useful, text to have on their mind. But then we move on and we get into sort of more internal things that reach every single human being, because the greatest literature is going to go right straight to those unanswerable questions. These Russian classics, they're called accursed questions, as probably most listeners know, because they cannot be answered. And that makes literature so great, is that this writer goes, okay, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to try and answer this question, or I'm going to pose it in a new way. And that's eternal, it doesn't change. I think what has changed a little bit with the generations is that people's attention spans are shorter, and that's based on the fact that we do a lot of Twitter and blogging. I myself am guilty, the short genres and multimedia, having all the images come at you, makes it a little bit more of a heavy lift for students to sit and read. And my students routinely tell me they spend more time on reading literature for my classes than they do for their chemistry or math, and so on. So I do think that learning to read and devoting your attention to the book takes more energy now than it used to. But that said, my students are absolutely brilliant. They're great readers. I always learn from them. And so I don't see a sort of decline in the humanities that people complain about. I see actually a period now. I think it's really just maybe good, where people were shut in their building, their homes, and had nothing else to do, but read books. I do think that experience that the entire world went through has been conducive to allowing us to get deep and think about more sort of eternal matters, whatever they be, whatever our concerns are. And I see it in my students. They really, really are very, very engaged in ways that maybe more so than in some previous generations.
That's interesting. You mentioned the pandemic, and maybe there's a parallel there when talking to older Russians about all of the reading they did during the Soviet period. One of the common themes was, well, that was one of the few things that we had to do, and it was an escape, and we had a lot of time to do it. And it's sort of that environment sort of facilitated that deep reading.
Mm-hmm. I think my image is gonna. You can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes, I can see you.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay, so I think I guess when we're troubled about things, we want a deeper answer, or not even an answer, but maybe a sense that somebody else is also experiencing the same questions that we have. That's what you get in literature, where you're alone. You're the only one experiencing this horrible dilemma in your inner psyche, whatever that might be, whether it's about the nature of the universe or whether it's about some romance that you've had that's failed. You feel very much alone. But then when you read a novel, you realize that these people, maybe they're not real, these characters, but they're thinking the same way you are. They're thinking about the same problem. And there's that community that you get, or that sense that you're not alone in the universe. Then the beautiful thing about that is that it's not just you and these dead people, or these fake people, but it's actually you and everybody else who's read that book. Everybody else in the planet who's read that book has something in common with you. And so that kind of community, I find, certain other ways, community is built in other ways too. Like everybody likes a certain musician, let's say, right, or pop star or whatever. And that too is a way of bonding. I think the engagement and the sort of level of engagement and trust maybe that you develop of other people that comes from literature is quite unusual. You know, maybe sort of the equivalent to what you get in great music, that like great classical music, let's say, or something that people really, really go deep into. But with literature, you have also the words, you know, the actual problems that are also developing within that great symphony of the text. So again, I forgot your question, you know, but the other thing is with Dostoevsky, the more I read him, the more I really do get the sense that his real focus is on the human being alone, the isolated human being, the person who thinks, mostly in Dostoevsky, of course, it's a male, this person who thinks he's alone, and therefore can't communicate with other people. And all the evil that they suffer comes from that sense of isolation. It's philosophical, it's cultural, because Russian culture is more like oriented towards a communal or, you know, I don't know how to put this, you know, family, community, and the Western culture is more focused on individual enterprise and you know, achievement and so on. So that's it is a focus of Dostoevsky, that sense that characters who've spent too much time by themselves suffer. And then he also gives you these narratives, you know, of demonic possession, where the devil is actually generated by this sense of isolation. You know, you generate your own double. Doubles are big in Dostoevsky. And who are these doubles? Well, usually they're people who are generated by a character, not people, but I don't know, ghosts or something. You know, they're generated by a character who's been spending too much time with himself and therefore creates himself sort of like an imaginary twin. Dostoevsky writes about this. It's not just me making it up.
Right.
It
Yeah,
sounds pretty cool, you know. He even has a book called The Double,
right.
but we do have them in most of the major novels. It makes them really kind of exciting to get into. It's like, who is this person and where did he come from? Is he real, in fact, or is he a projection of this character's lonely mind? So I won't say any more about it because I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about.
No, that's wonderful. Have you ever had students who come into your course because they might be interested in Russian literature and then they become attached to Dostoevsky and then start their career in Russian studies?
Oh, wow. I mean, there's sort of two nuances here. I will say that absolutely we have students who get hooked. It's like they do the cool and that's it for life. It's kind of what happened to me, I guess. You know, I'm like, okay, Dostoevsky, I'll do some more. As we all know, in this talk and just everywhere, there's not really a career anymore, you know, in teaching Russian classic literature or any classic literature. The humanities, in terms of the institutions of you know, universities and so on, they are sort of fighting for the existence. Students in particular feel that they're, you know, for example, in university to build careers, and that it's really very, very important to do that. And I understand that mindset. But building a career in, you know, computer science, which of course is huge now, is very, very different from what you do when you get into a work of literature. You know, so I don't think most of my students take a literature class because they want to become literature professors. And if they do, I have them come in my office and say, well, you know, that's probably not going to happen. You know, it's simply a reality. You know, it's the reality of the job market. So really we have to shift over. I'm not generating my own mind in the classroom. You know, I'm building a conversation that I hope will be of value to them. And the big payoff for me, I guess, is when a student gets in touch with me 10 years later and says, you know, I've been reading Russian literature. You know, to me, that's important. And I'm not selling it as a way to make a career, unfortunately. It can serve you. You know, recently, I was just reading in the paper this morning, soft skills are coming back. You know, it's not just learning a program. It's like you actually have to have people along with you, or your program, you know, is not going to make it. So soft skills are very important. And this kind of engagement that we have with sort of deep books, I don't want to sound pretentious, but, you know, the time we devote to getting in those books and then sharing a conversation with others who've done it it can't be measured really what you do, but it's extremely important because it builds empathy and understanding. It builds listening skills. It also builds stamina. You know, you're able to concentrate on a whole story that goes on for however many, 800 pages or something, or even more. That takes a certain commitment, you know, that you don't necessarily get when you're doing a lot of some of the skill type training that people do. It's not to denigrate that, because if I were 18 years old now, I would absolutely probably be not, certainly I should do this because I'm going to discourage people from, from majoring in Russian, but be careful. But actually do think seriously about how they're going to build a career and actually pay for health insurance and that kind of thing. But at the same time, also nurture and educate minds and develop in themselves a lifetime of curiosity about the world, and an ability to understand that everybody comes from a different place. All of us are different. Nobody knows what's going on in anybody's mind. And so you can develop by understanding that you really don't know where the person is coming from. And I think when he's talking to you, and I think that's something literature does do, if you do it right. If I don't just go in there and harangue my students about how this is about, realism or romanticism, or this is a particular type of, literary theory in action, we use that kind of scaffolding and that kind of thinking. But it really is important to get into real connections level when we read. And none of that is going to give my kids a job. Although what's funny is that often it happens in job interviews. When my kids go, they interview to be consultants, let's say, which is a very big career path for some of our Duke students. And then there'll be 100 kids interviewed for a certain number of positions. And the kids who rise to the top are people who can say, yeah, I actually got into Russian literature. That's quite unusual,
Right.
And that's very, it's a great interest to an interviewer who's been spending like 4 days talking to everybody who's done the same thing.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So.
Well, I know you said that, so we're gonna talk about Chekhov and your journey across Siberia. And I want you to know that I actually picked up the Sakhalin Island and read some of it. I just started. And I love it. It's a book that I've always wanted to read, but I hadn't. And getting prepared for this talk, I thought, well, I should start reading it. And you made a comment a while back that this isn't something you assign to your students, but it's actually a fascinating book. I mean, I think I connected with it emotionally very quickly. I think it's a wonderful book.
Yeah, I do assign it, but I get complaints, and so basically I don't assign the whole book. Mostly because Chekhov is so rich. I mean, as your listeners know, and I think we know, I mean, he's the world master of the theater. He's the world master of the short story. Absolutely. It's not even challenged. And he's absolutely the world master of epistolary writing. Of his letters are works of genius too. And then he only lived for 44 years. In the middle of all this, he produced more literary characters than any other well-known Russian writer. And I know that's a little counterintuitive because, but what's interesting then is you're always making a choice. Do we read Ward 6 or do we read, a part of Sakhalin Island? And we go in for the fiction and the theater, the drama, and a little bit of letters. And then with Sakhalin Island, I picked some parts that I think they're going to be really engaged in. For the discussion of women, for example, on the island is very, very interesting, super interesting. Of the punishment methods and corporal punishment. But, the book is utterly fascinating to me. I just can't put it down. It's amazing. And one reason it is, but this is something that's hard to convey in a classroom, is that having read Chekhov's, literary writing, he goes into this Sakhalin Island, which is a very different type of writing. It's absolutely factual and scientific. This is one of the first great works of statistical science, actually. So I could even get imperialistic here, say not just those other three modes, but also statistics. Chekhov is also the master of statistics. He's certainly an early practitioner of that. He was actually science. He was a doctor, and you don't hear about that so much because he did so much else. And that focus on science is absolutely part of what he was trying to do when he went to Sakhalin. When I say science, I mean, he was obviously a doctor, knew his biology inside and out, but a deeper level of science is this empiricism, right? Getting all the facts from the world, the geography, the temperature flows, the weather patterns, all of these things are factual. And when you're writing fiction, you sort of choose the facts from the environment that you need to build that artistic text. And so when I read Chekhov's Sakhalin Island, which again, I repeat, I love it as you do, to me, it's this very strange inversion of what he's doing in his fiction, where in the fiction, he's always writing about something that he's not saying. You know what I mean? Like the main conflict in a play is something that happens off stage, let's say, or happened in the past. And I'm sure if your listeners have read a play, they know that every single Chekhov play has a death at the center of it that determines everything else that goes on in the play. And, you know, you think back on the plays, I won't go into it now, but that death is not depicted. You know, someone drowned several years ago, you know, a father is not there. And the three sisters are kind of homeless, sort of, in a weird way. And so what he does is he doesn't write about the most important thing that determines everything else. But in Sakhalin Island, he's doing the opposite. You know, he's measuring, he's weighing, he's interviewing and writing down people's, as you know, you've seen it, you know, their gender, their religion, their family status, their, you know, all of this is factual. And so when I read the two together, it's almost like the complete, you know, range of activity that a person's mind can do through language, right? In the one, you're avoiding saying the main thing, and in the letting the reader figure it out. In the other, you're just looking right at the reader and saying, okay, these are the facts. And I feel it's very interesting. I've not written about this. I'd like to. You feel a great restraint on the Chekhov who writes Sakhalin Island, a great restraint, which is like he could do so much with this material, but it's the facts that he's presenting to you. So we go into it a little bit, and it's an extraordinary, not, I don't know, puzzle, but just fact about Chekhov's writing, that he did all of this. And in doing so, I think he really covered the full range of human intellectual potential. I hope I'm not overstating that, but that's what I feel when I read Chekhov, which is why many people read Chekhov, they get these dewy eyes, you know, and they just love him. And he's like a puppy that everybody just loves to hold. I hate to put it, there's a New Yorker cartoon about that, I think. But I won't go into it. I actually bought the cartoon and posted it.
So let's talk about Chekhov's journey across Russia to Sakhalin Island. Which is a journey that you then retrace his steps. And so we have some images here. So we'll move through these relatively quickly. I think I have like 50 or 60 images, which you've seen. And we can go through your journey. What I'm interested, well, the first thing I want to ask is why? Why did he go to Sakhalin Island? And I think this is a mystery. So you're not on the hook for having the answer.
Thank you for answering it. I appreciate that. I mean, it's everybody asks this, right? And there's actually been really wonderful scholarly writing about this problem. Why did Chekhov go to Sakhalin? But it's not been answered, you know, in the same way that you really, honestly, I don't think you can really answer fully why you do anything yourself. It's a little bit too, maybe that's a little too abstract. But so there are many, many reasons Chekhov went to Sakhalin. It's been written about very, very well by scholars. You know, he was at the top of his profession as a writer. He just won a big writing award. His works were just in demand, and everybody loved him. He's very popular. So why would he leave that? You know, another sort of way of that. So that's the question. Why would he leave it? And why would he leave that fame and fortune, all that attention? And you know, be a potential answer is, you know, to see, I mean, is this all I can do, you know, explore something else? So I think that's kind of a primitive answer. But then there's sort of emotional and family reasons. You know, he was extremely attracted to women and he had a lot of girlfriends after him and so on. And so you could say, well, yes, you know, fleeing that, he had family responsibilities that when he managed to get to the point where he could make enough money to ensure that they would be cared for. And when I say family, I mean, he never married. Well, he did marry, but I'm sorry about that. He never had children, for example. He had to take care of, but his parents needed his care and so on, his brothers and sisters. And so he took care of them and then finally made enough money that he could leave. He didn't have to sort of be all the time. So he was free to leave. There's also the fact that despite the fact that he's the greatest writer who ever lived, or as some will say, there are many other great writers, so forget that part. But he was truly one of the world's great masters of the word. He really always wanted to be a professor, and which is crazy for me because I'm a professor. Like most professors now, they just want to be writers. I don't know if it's kind of a cliche. It's like, well, you can't write, but at least you can be a professor and read a lot of books. So, but he really did have this motivation. He wanted to build a scholarly career and be a researcher and a professor. And to do that, he had to write, one has to write a dissertation and pass committees and so on. And so the Sakhalin Island became that project for him. And it was almost, the way the thing took shape, it was almost like a complete renunciation of fiction and drama and a complete sort of all-in focus on science. And when I say science, I do mean like a sort of statistical study. That was the form that it took. And of course, his medical expertise and training played a role in that thinking as well. So the question was, why did Chekhov go to Sakhalin Island? And so I'm like, okay, let me try and figure it out. All these people have studied it and have come up with ideas, and maybe I'll think about that too.
Why did you go?
Yeah, well, see, that's the problem. It's like I didn't figure out why Chekhov went. I just, had my little breadcrumbs, I guess, that I bring into the big feast of this conversation. But why did I go? I will say that I'm a fan of the road trip. I like to just sort of move through space, and that's I'm a motorsports fan in the sense that I like motorcycles and horseback riding and so on. I like moving through space from one place to another, and somehow weirdly in that kind of a mode, being in the world, moving through space, I can do my best thinking. So I was thinking about traveling and thinking this morning, and if those of us who've read Anna Karenina, for example, know that when Tolstoy needs his characters to think deeply about something, he puts them in motion, right? So, Dali is going to see Anna Karenina on the countryside. And so Tolstoy puts her in a horse carriage and then just describes her thoughts as she moves through space. Or Karenin, his wife, is out partying with Vronsky, and Karenin doesn't want to be jealous, but he's pacing through his house. And with every room, a new thought comes up. So I think that like that kind of thinking that you do when you just really can't do anything else. I can't do the dishes when I'm, riding a train to Siberia. That's a pretty extreme way of escaping your daily responsibilities. But, so yeah, you asked what I did. That's part of it, just wanting to be in motion.
Sure.
And part of it was, just to see what Chekhov saw. And then, of course, the huge thing, which is, what is Siberia? It's the biggest landmass on the planet. It is huge. People, what is there in the middle of it? It's this huge history of exploration, and of course the sort of prisons that were there in Tsarist Russia, which was why Chekhov went. He wanted to explore that Sakhalin the whole thing was a prison colony. You were either a prisoner there or you were a bureaucrat or jailer, taking care of the prisoner. So there's that part of Siberian history, but I think Siberian history and culture. But I think there's this deeper thing where, if you're in a city, you're like, what do these people do out there? I've got everything I need. I can go and get a cappuccino with oat milk, whatever here and even in Durban, I can do that. But what are you going to do in the middle of Siberia? So it's a really something I wanted to experience. And I think probably the place I felt most deeply, the importance of just being in a completely different space and allowing yourself a lot of time just to be there and not overthinking was probably near Irkutsk, actually. There's a village, and also on the day
Hold on one second. We have some audio disturbance.
Okay,
go ahead. We're good.
All right. So I think those moments along the way of this trip, which was long and slow, and that was the whole point of it, what had to do with, for example, being in this place in near Irkutsk, where there's a lot of shamanism, in that culture, and that there's a mixture of religions sort of between, the Tibetan Buddhism, let's say, and then the Siberian shamanism, and they sort of come together in this very potent space near Lake Baikal, and you can actually sort of feel it, in a way that you cannot express in words. And part of it for me,
get to that. I have some photos from the Datsun near Ulan-Ude that we can
okay,
show.
great.
I was thinking what we could do is we could just quickly go through your itinerary.
Okay.
And we pulled up a few images of each of the points along the way. And
Okay.
what I think would be interesting, because most of the people on this call already probably know these places, have been to these places, maybe they're from these places. What's interesting is what you're talking about, what your response is, what your reactions are, what you learn about Russians, about Chekhov. And I think it's fair to say you followed Chekhov's footsteps, but inevitably it became a Dostoevsky journey as well, because he also very famously went across Siberia and spent time there before returning. So in your blog, it goes back and forth, Chekhov, Dostoevsky, often both in the same place. But I see you. So you started your journey here in Petersburg. Well, here I'm not in Petersburg, but here on the screen.
Yeah. Well, this is and that turned out to be both, of course. This here is Novaya Vremya, the New Time, the editorial offices of the journal where Chekhov did a lot of publishing, and where his good friend, the editor, Surin, owned the journal. Oh, it's not a journal, actually, it's a newspaper. So this editorial office is like a place where Chekhov put his footprints. What I'm doing is saying, well, there might still be a particle of air, that Chekhov breathed. I'm breathing here. I mean, that's part of the whole adventure of it. Yeah, this is the sort of pretext for being in Petersburg, is places like these. And this is the Dostoevsky Museum in Petersburg, with, Dostoevsky lived when he wrote The Brothers Karamazov. And it really is truly the great, this is sort of, I guess, one of the great Dostoevsky museums, one of the great Dostoevsky museums, and one of the great literary museums, I think, of the world, frankly. They do a lot of scholarship there. And of course, my colleagues there, including Boris Tikhomirov, were extremely helpful for me as I was figuring out my journey. So Petersburg is for both. So that's very democratic, I guess. Although Chekhov didn't live in Petersburg.
Right. That's what I thought was interesting, that you started there, because he doesn't really. The only connection to Petersburg was the publishing house, right?
One of the things about journeys, particularly if you're a strapped for cash academic, is you sort of also have to kind of plan things on opportunities. And I was extremely lucky on this project. I could not have visited a lot of these places if I hadn't been able to be on a Volga River excursion that maybe some people know about how this works, but alumni of different universities come together and they take a trip, So I was able to be on a Volga River trip from Petersburg to Moscow, where I, gave some lectures and sort of served there as a resident professor on the ship. And so that in Petersburg, and that's why I began in Petersburg. And that's why I was able to go to Uglitch, for example, which, look at you just found the picture before I even, I got there because I was on this boat trip, and it stops at Uglitch, which is a very famous place in history. But we had a short, maybe an hour and a half or something, 2 hours, where we were allowed to walk around through the town before the ship again. And I was just an hour into wandering around and looking at things. And I thought, oh my gosh, Chekhov's brother lived in Uglitch. Somehow I remember this, And this means I'm a bad scholar. I should have figured this out and had it all planned out. But I thought, oh my gosh, yes, in Uglitch. And so I was literally at the Beeline phone place where I had to get my phone fixed. I'm like, oh, by the way, you guys know, wasn't there a Chekhov who lived here? And then this babushka was there shopping for a cell phone. And I said, there was this conversation there. And this babushka, she says, oh, yeah, you just walked down whatever the street was. And I just grabbed my phone and just ran, because I only had 20 minutes till the boat was to leave. And I did find it. And this courtyard here, in fact, a picture of the courtyard in the house where Mikhail Chekhov lived, Chekhov's brother. So that was one of my most exciting discoveries because it sort of came on its own.
Right. You know, it's interesting. I was reading your blog about that moment, and I've experienced that as well. Many people have, but I wanted to ask you, why do you think it's so meaningful when we're able to breathe the air that someone that we esteem also breathes, walk those steps where he or she walked? Why is that so powerful?
It is incredibly powerful. And you know, gosh, I mean, we could talk about it a lot, right? But one thing, sort of it's tangible, but it's also intangible, right? Everything has changed. Everything has changed since that time. Although I must say that these pictures we're looking at, probably not a whole lot has changed, you know. So I think it's more, there's what's more maybe important about this is the way it helps you think through what it is you're interested in. You know, I love Anton Chekhov. And Anton Chekhov had some experiences. I'm not trying to duplicate them, but I'm trying to sort of have a conversation with him a little bit, and with all the other people who also be interested in Chekhov. You know, that's really what it comes down to. And so, honestly, it enables you to focus on that. I'm here because of Chekhov, you know, in a way that you just can't do in your office, which is where I am now. I'm here because of my job and my students and so on. So there's something about getting out of that space and being in a completely different space. It kind of inspires your thinking to go a little bit deeper about what it is you love about these works of art that have moved you. And then even more importantly, I guess, is that in every single one of these spaces, every single one of them, I had a really sort of meaningful engagement with a human being that I didn't anticipate happening. You know, this babushka in the phone store, it became a hugely important part, honestly, of my life. You know, and I will never see her again. I never saw her before. I don't know her name. And there's something very kind of beautiful about sort of throwing yourself into the arms of these strangers who really do sort of pick you up and take care of you. I'm being literal, but obviously I'm talking about this emotional thing. We usually are afraid of other people. I mean, I don't know. That's a default for a lot of us. You know, we're worried that people might treat us badly, or, you know, whatever. We have these fears. And the fact is, as I've learned in Siberia more than any place else, that human beings we're all on this planet together, you know, and we actually have really no overt hostility towards each other as human beings. That's one of the things that I learned through reading literature too. So I think that was a huge lesson I got here. And now we're at Melikova, but in every place I went, realizing that our connections as human beings are hugely important, and they're there, and they're to be trusted, actually.
You know, it's one of the things that I think Russia has done for me as well. I think of being in these oops, sorry, I just hit a button. You find yourself in these far-flung places in Siberia or in some strange place in some part of Moscow you've never been. And you manage to get out of situations. You manage to find your way. People help. And I think one of the things I learned in Russia was you'll always find your way out, because even in the most unfamiliar place, you're going to have not only someone to help you, but you can have this completely beautiful experience, and a very human experience, like you just described at the phone store. You know,
Yeah. Well, it's also about vulnerability, right? We always protect ourselves as being strong and confident. It's something important to us. If you're vulnerable, if you're strong and confident, they're not going to be feeling inclined to help you. You know, but when you need help, people feel that. You know, it's a human thing. Let's help this poor person who's in trouble here. Meaning, I never sort of had a terrible issue that people had to lug me off to the emergency room or something. But there are many, many cases where I don't know where I am. Someone help me find my way. You know, and that vulnerability is what really actually opens you up to these real human connections that people really, and, you know, think about yourself. You see someone in trouble, most of the time you're not going to kick them in the face. You know, you're going to think about, well, let's help this poor person. You know, so that was an important message.
So here we are at Melikova, which is his home south of Moscow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is Chekhov's. This is another one of the great museums. He lived there and for a while in the early 90s, basically 1890s. He had to leave when his tuberculosis got very bad. He had to leave that climate. But many of his really, really profound works were written there. And I guess given the context of our conversation, I could say that Chekhov was a great, great writer, but his works after he came back from Sakhalin Island became incredibly profound and deep and probing. I'm thinking about works like Ward 6, which I don't know if there's anything deeper than Ward 6, or, you know, The Black Monk, which is what Ward 6 does, but on the level of human psychology. Both of these works written at Melikova, it's and infused, I think, with his experiences and thoughts that came to him on the Sakhalin trip. The sense of deep engagement with things that are important. You know, Chekhov writes about things that are important, and so do the other Russian writers we're talking about. They're not just trying to sell books; they're trying to do that too, right? But this is like, yes, we're going to get into something really human and really important in these books. That's why we all love these books so much. And Chekhov, so Chekhov's place in Melikova becomes actually a center for thinking about Chekhov, and I was able to do here with the people at the museum. This package that you see here, if you look super closely, oh geez, I can't even read it now, but it's his census portfolio. Chekhov, which reminds us, I haven't mentioned this, but Chekhov, in addition to all these other things he was a master of, he was also an incredible, let's say, public servant. You know, he was very active in sort of what we would now call service activities, unpaid service to society, for example, famine relief. Or Chekhov was a doctor, and mostly he didn't accept any pay. Can you imagine that in this day and age? A man who wrote literature to make money, but doctored for free. It's like my students' brains kind of explode when they hear that. You know, it's like that. It's completely the opposite. But another thing that he did was participated in the census, which was something new. And of course, he did on Sakhalin Island was a census. You know, literally counting every human being, and important facts, recordings and facts about these people. So
when he did that on Sakhalin Island, was that part of a national census project, or was that just for his own research?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the United States, it would be, yeah, the government is doing this, right? With Chekhov, it was his own initiative. And what that meant was mostly we don't hear about all the work that went into actually planning this trip, right? It's boring, right? You go to bureaucrats, you appeal for money, you fundraise, you do all those things that would just bore you to tears if you had to read about it. But if you read his letters of the time or memoirs of other people, you realize how much work he had to do to just get permission to do this trip. You know, it was a new thing. This is not something people did. Sakhalin was a prison island. You know, not everybody's just going to a prison, you know, allowed to go to a prison island. These are very heavily barricaded spaces and activities. I've even forgotten the question now, but
well, he did the census.
It wasn't official. I would put it that way.
That point is interesting.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it was sort of weird. I mean, who would do this in our culture today? Who would say, "Oh, I think I'll just do a census of I don't know, Colorado or something," right? No. So that was quite unusual. But in his day and age, they're really, you know, hadn't been done before. So this thing about Chekhov's initiative to do this project is it's very interesting. But he had to get an awful lot of permissions to do it.
And you know, reading in the book, almost from the very beginning. At the beginning, there's a scene where he's talking about he's on a boat. You know, he's making his way across Siberia, which I think on our next slide we're going to start going to Siberia with you. He's making his way across, and someone on the boat says, "Well, there's no way you're going to be able to visit a prison colony. That's just not even possible." And so he's thinking, you know, he hasn't even made it to Siberia to do, but of course he continues on. So there must be a lot of strong will there to make it happen.
Yeah, you know, it's hard for us to imagine It was a really weird thing to do. I think that's one of the reasons why so many people are interested in it and trying to puzzle it out. Like, who would actually do that? And he has travel notes of his journey there that are absolutely fascinating. They're absolutely fascinating because you realize, first of all, the train didn't go that far. The train went to Ekaterinburg, which you're seeing on the left. And also, well, actually, all three of these shots are from Ekaterinburg. After that, he had to get on a peasant cart, actually. And then with every river, the rivers in Siberia run north and south. It's not like you can just get on one and like sail east. You've got to actually cross them. And, at certain times in the seasons, they are, they're flooding. So it's much, much harder to get across them. And that by the way, that I will get back to your question in a minute, but it did occur to us about our conversation, what we would be talking about. And it occurred to me that journeys really change depending on how fast you're going, right? So Chekhov went super slow. And, for Irkutsk, for example, he wanted to get across Lake Baikal, but he missed the boat. So he'd sit there for 3 days, and wait for the next one or something. This kind of thing happens all the time. It's like in our day and age, you can't even imagine that, right? Okay, we'll spend 3 or 4 days waiting for the next plane or something. It's like, no, time is money. So what that does, it you realize that the journey itself is really the point. Like, if you don't appreciate where you are at the moment, what else are you going to appreciate in your life? Because you're spending 2.5 months out there on your way to the prison, and there is this sort of suspense. Are they going to let me in? Or am I going to have to turn around and go back? Which is, I'm sure it's something that was on his mind. But I was thinking about these rivers again, and when you study Russia and particularly Siberia, you know that the whole thing is just very watery. The whole Siberian area. It looks like land. Yeah, it's land, but it's there's a lot of it that's tundra, for example, the northern part. That's all water, right? And so the flow of the seasons changes the solidity of the earth under your feet. Right? The winter traveling is pretty easy, but it's freezing cold, right? It's because everything's frozen, right? No problem. In the spring, everything melts, the snow melts, and it can't, try and cross like a territory where it's like 2 feet deep of water. That would be ice in the winter. So this is the kind of obstacle you face. But I was thinking about this and thinking that, yeah, if you stay out there long enough, you really get a sense of the flow of organic and cyclical time in a way that you don't in a city where you're surrounded by asphalt and you can just turn the heater up, when it gets cold. No, the ground is squishy at certain times of the year, and then you wait, and then it gets hard, and then it gets squishy again. So it's a very a perception of the world that takes a lot of patience and time spent in one place. So that may have been a little bit too much of a digression, but the travel notes are fantastic. And one point where he's near Blagoveshchensk, and his boat, breaks down. He gets stuck on a sandbar. And he's stuck on this boat, and like in the middle of Siberia, and then like nobody's going anywhere, and the boats are just stuck there. So he goes, well, might as well just enjoy it while I'm here. Might as well just appreciate it because I ain't going anywhere. There's something about that in slow travel where you really, really appreciate where you are every moment. Even if you look outside, and there's really absolutely nothing going on. And that's really about yourself and your being on the planet. I think that's maybe the deeper messages you get with that kind of a trip.
Sure. If only we could all describe those moments like Chekhov does. He turns this into literature.
Absolutely, he does. That's a really good point. I hadn't made that Chekhovian. It's malpractice. I should have associated with Chekhov the whole time. I love this. This is outside of Yekaterinburg. So Yekaterinburg and the Ural Mountains, which is where that city is located, is the division between Europe and Asia. And it's just hilarious for me to realize as I was studying up on this, to realize that, well, it's a sort of a fuzzy barrier that kind of goes down the Ural Mountains, but where is it exactly? It's not like an ocean that really makes it quite clear that your land is ending somewhere. So this is a sort of border that somebody just drew, down. And the Ural Mountains are not very high mountains. Everybody observes that when they see them. They're like, where are the mountains? This are like hilly, basically, at least the ones I saw. So on the left, I love this sign so much. Buy one coffee and also buy a second coffee. It's sort of like, instead of buy one, get one free. It's like, no, buy the other one too. I don't know. I just love that. And I guess you appreciate jokes more when you have so much time. I'm like, okay, I'll sit here and enjoy this joke for a while. And then over here are the prayer ribbons, which are very, very Asian, very much part of Eastern culture, Eastern religion. You don't see these prayer ribbons, at least displayed in nature like these. So that kind of tells you, yeah, you're in Asia.
Yes, I was surprised to see those here. I've seen them in Buryatia, but I didn't know that as far east or west as Yekaterinburg, they also.
Yeah, and I suspect. I mean, I didn't bring my prayer ribbon. I hadn't thought of. Never will be able to do this. But I suspect that a lot of people come from Asia. This would be a very, very important place for travelers from the East to come and say, yeah, this is where we end and they begin, or something. And so, yeah, I did see Japanese, or actually, I don't remember. I think some Japanese people I saw there, and some other Asians had clearly made this trip because this is the border of the two. So I associate that with those visitors as well. Tumen, Chekhov passed through, and this is again. I had colleagues who helped me at every place I went. Tumen is actually where Lenin was taken. His body. When he was in the Lenin mausoleum, but during World War II, it moved that, and so they shipped him out to Tumen, and he was there in some kind of mausoleum there during the war. Here, I think my focus was on the postal service because, and actually in every single town, the post office was very important to Chekhov, right? He would post his notes back. He had to write travel notes to be published by Suvornin. So he had to get to the post office and publish them. Or and mail them to Suvornin from these post offices. And so I took note of them. And I think one thing that really I thought was kind of cool to learn about was that, there you are in the middle of Siberia. And in terms of Siberian history, you sort of picture it as being kind of like the Wild West, and there's no law and people are just criminals escaped from prisons and so on in the 19th century. And yet it was absolutely routine and part of the culture for people to send like cash, through the postal service, and that was very reliable, and you didn't lose imagine you've written travel notes that you're going to earn income from, and you have to send them to your publisher. You only have one copy, and you just drop it in the mailbox. And these days, yeah, we keep a file. You still have another one handy in case someone loses it. So I thought about the post office a lot in Tumen. An interesting town, and all these Siberian towns. What's
amazing? Amazing to think that you would drop your notes into the mail and then wait and the cash would then arrive. Would he send the cash ahead so that he had it during
actually, I kind of overstated that. I mean,
I guess he got paid when he got back.
Yeah, he had banking arrangements back home. I guess his family was near Moscow. So basically, Suvorin's minions, I guess, would deposit the money in a bank account or have money orders. However they did that. That's actually, I'm a little fuzzy in the actual mechanics of it. So the money didn't come back out to Chekhov. Right. It went to his family, and they could pick it up, at the post office and then go to the bank or something. But yeah, the post office was it. I mean, that was it. That was the way people had to communicate across these distances. It was quite reliable. I learned a lot of this at the Melikova Post Office Museum. It's a lovely museum. Chekhov initiated the post office there in Melikova because he just needed to use it so much. So he helped, initiate the creation of the post office there. This is Tobolsk, incredible town. It's not on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And so I think there are two towns, and I think we'll probably see Tomsk in a minute, but these two towns, Tobolsk and Tomsk, are very important for these Russian writers. Very important. Tobolsk is the old capital of Siberia, one of them, I guess. And as you can see, it's this beautiful, beautiful Kremlin there in the center of the town. And totally vacant. I was the only person there, really, visiting. Whereas if you go to the Moscow Kremlin, at least when I've been in the past, huge lines, kind of a mob scene, lots of noise and excitement, and you've got to rush through. This Kremlin is extremely beautiful and interesting and historic, and you just have the whole place to yourself. And the reason for that, even though this is one of Russia's most interesting towns, I think, it's because the railroad does not go there. The Trans-Siberian Railroad does not go there. I went there because it's an important Dostoevsky spot. Chekhov didn't go through Tobolsk, as far as I know. No, he didn't. But this town of Tobolsk, which is very beautiful here, this is not the beautiful part of Tobolsk that Dostoevsky spent time in. He was taken to Siberia as part of a prison convoy in the dead of winter, Siberian winter, in the January of 1850, and was taken to Tobolsk, where there was a transit prison there. This was a major center for distributing prisoners through Siberia. So all the Petroshevsky group, what he was convicted with, this was the political conviction he had, they were all brought to Tobolsk, and from there they were sent to different places. So there was a transit prison there that he spent a few days in, and this is very important for Dostoevsky, because I'm just trying to see if I've got, here we go. Yeah, this is great. On my bookshelf, which I don't know if you can see. No, probably not. So I will pass it around and see if I can get this off my shelf. In Tobolsk is where some of the Decembrist wives were, including von Wiesena, and these, okay. So these wives, Decembrist wives, really cared a lot. And you have to just read history. I won't go into it, but it was a very, very important group of political prisoners who also went to Siberia in 1825. And so while Dostoevsky was in the transit prison there, these Decembrist wives who'd been there for, 25 years at this point, just exiled to Siberia. These were high nobility, actually, being princesses and whatnot. They're stuck in Siberia. And they gave Dostoevsky a Bible that he then carried on further into. I've got a facsimile of it that came from Tobolsk, and so this is what the thing looks like. This is an absolute facsimile of the Bible that Dostoevsky was Dostoevsky's only reading while he was in prison for 4 years in Omsk. So it's a very, very important place in terms of the places linked to Russian writers in understanding Dostoevsky's mindset. It's a good orientation point. He received this Bible, and it was the only thing he really was able to read officially for the next 4 years. He was snuck some other reading in prison, like Dickens and some other things maybe, but mostly the Bible, which he read and read and read and read and read. And if you read his mature novels, you'll feel that, he comes out of that particular reading experience. And all this happened in Tobolsk. There's a person in Tobolsk who does a lot of activity sort of promoting Siberian culture. And this is where this particular Bible came from, this facsimile. And also the statue is in the middle of Tobolsk. If you look carefully at this statue, you'll see the names that mark Dostoevsky's, the fact that Dostoevsky was heading to prison. There are a lot of great Dostoevsky statues that I've seen kind of around the world. This is a really, really good one. Really, really just a wonderful Dostoevsky statue that you'll see if you go to Tobolsk. I encourage people to go to Tobolsk. It's a very, very interesting place historically, and for Russian literature, it's interesting.
I'll definitely put that on my list. I think we're all thinking about when we can go back to Russia and visit these places. So where would we go? And this would be one. So is it safe to say then, or fair to say that the Decembrist wives gave Dostoevsky that Bible, and that played an outsized role in his transformation while he was in Siberia?
Yeah, I think it's safe to do that. As much as you can attach anybody's spiritual, intellectual life to any sort of object, it's certainly about the most potent thing. that
Right. I mean, he wouldn't have
that
had
you
a Bible otherwise, perhaps.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I'm assuming that he probably would have had a Bible, you know what I
Someone would
mean? But
have a Bible.
yeah, because it was the only thing they allowed people to read, and there were, you know, there were churches there and so on. So I think another interesting point, though, that question brings up is a lot of prisoners were illiterate, right? So if you're in prison in Siberia during that period, it's likely you weren't able to read anyway, you know, and that religious experience. They took the prisoners to church, you know, and they to service. That was one thing that was done as part of their experience there. Um, and yes, but also um, for the literate prisoners, I don't know the answer to that question. It's a really great question. Like, did you just sort of sign into prison and they give you your uniform and then a little Bible or something? I mean, you know, kind of like when you go to a hotel in the United States, you open the bedside table, you know, there's a Bible. But what is interesting though is not so much like I think he would have read the Bible, you know, I do think so, but he wouldn't have read this one. You know, this one. What's so special about it is it was touched by these Decembrist wives who had also suffered in Siberia for their political crimes or their husbands' political crimes and so on. So it is hugely important. And this is from same um, his name Arkady Yefimov in Tobolsk does a lot of these Siberian projects where he does facsimile publications, for example, of old maps. It's just an incredible number of projects. They're full size or actual size of the original maps. The statue is another example of these kinds of projects that elevate Siberian culture and history. I personally love maps, and so these old atlases, these are not the originals. These are copies that are made of them that are incredibly faithful to the original. And you know, I think that what thing about maps, I mean, this gives an opportunity to think about maps in general. Like, you know, did the cavemen have maps? You know, the cavemen need maps? No, you know, something about maps, you know, and this is of course part of our whole discussion about traveling, that sort of mark the way that human civilization addresses this problem of moving through space, right? How we define space, you know, in the old maps, and I saw some in Kazan as well in the library there, just an amazing collection of old documents. They don't have GPS, you know, they can't just fly drones and take pictures and get everything perfect. So you start thinking about it and you realize what a huge amount of labor and intellectual energy and sort of patience went into creating these early maps, which are hugely important, you know, yeah, the artistry. And then of course they, you know, in some of these you'll get, you know, pictures of the animals, you know, that lived in this or that location. I really do feel that I could spend lots and lots of time just kind of looking at this kind of these old maps and thinking about what kind of a psychology went into creating them on this Siberian land. It sort of brings order to this vast, you know, some people think of it as sort of a vast canvas, you know, of nothingness. But if you take it slowly, you realize, as you do when you do anything slowly, you realize how much going on out there, you know. So this is the Irtysh River in Tobolsk. And the other thing about Tobolsk, which is, you know, over and above Dostoevsky, is that in the Russian Revolution, as we all know the story, right? The Alexander and Nicholas and Alexander, the last Romanov tsars, the emperors, and their children were taken out of Petersburg by the Bolsheviks, and they were evacuated to Tobolsk, actually. And who would think about that? But in Tobolsk, they lived for a few months, and there's a brand new museum there in Tobolsk that is in the house where they stayed, with a lot of exhibits of what their life was like. And these were the last months of their lives, this family, where, you know, they'd been deposed, they didn't know what their fate was. And we all know, of course, they would soon be taken, believe it or not, to Yekaterinburg, which we've already looked at, and would all be shot, you know, there in a basement. And so there's this kind of, I didn't know I would be experiencing this history but I did see all the churches on the blood. They're called the place, the location where a Tsar was murdered. There's one of these in Petersburg where Alexander II was blown up, I guess, terrorist. There's Uglich, which is where the little Prince Dmitri was supposedly died of an epileptic seizure, but he was murdered. And then there's this location. I'm sorry, the third one, Ekaterinburg. Yeah, Uglich and Ekaterinburg, of course, which is where they were shot. And so these churches on the blood are built on these sites. But here in Tobolsk is where they lived the last few months. So it's kind of a very moving kind of experience. Tobolsk is a very interesting place, well worth seeing. And that's the Irtysh River there in the background, which is important for Chekhov, who writes about it while he's sort of stuck on a boat on it. He writes very profound thoughts about sort of being stuck on the river is kind of also like being stuck in life. And then when the Irtysh is to Omsk, that is where Dostoevsky was. And of course, he saw the Irtysh River there. Irtysh riverbank is where Raskolnikov has his epiphany at the end of Crime and Punishment. So I was fortunate enough to see that river connected with both of my writers. This, by the way, this is from Omsk, the museum there in Omsk, the Dostoevsky Museum. The book that we see on the left is Dostoevsky's Notes from the Dead House, which he was called fiction, but it is really his prison memoir of life in the prison there, hard labor prison in Omsk, 4 years. And on the right, I was delighted to see this on exhibit, Leonid Lamb's prints related to Dostoevsky's House of the Dead. They're on exhibit there in the museum in Omsk, but we also have them, and this is a point of pride for me, we have some of these same Leonid Lamb artworks connected with House of the Dead also in our art museum on the Duke campus, which my students have seen. So it was very lovely.
Do your students read House of the Dead?
They do read House of the Dead. It's kind of a similar text, maybe in the same way to the Silent Island that we talked about earlier. I agree with Tolstoy that this is one of the top 5 books ever written. It's the most amazing thing. On the one hand, it's a memoir of prison. On the other hand, it's just a profound story about, death and resurrection. And the thing about Notes from the House of the Dead, which I always make my students read it. They don't read The Idiot. They read Notes from the House of the Dead. That was a trade I made for them. But what's so fascinating to me about Notes from the House of the Dead, and even now as we're talking, I'm realizing a connection that I hadn't made before. I talked before about how Chekhov's Sakhalin Island was kind of the opposite of his fiction, kind of like the other part of his mind that he didn't get to really indulge in, that is just writing the facts that he observes, right? In the case of House of the Dead, a similar thing is going on. It's very interesting. If you read Crime and Punishment, let's say, the whole novel practically takes place way deep inside Raskolnikov's mind. Raskolnikov is the murderer who's the protagonist of the novel, and you're inside his mind. And that's what Dostoevsky does. It's so original. And you sort of don't really always know what's actually going on outside his mind. That's the innovation that Dostoevsky deployed in that novel. But when you go to the House of the Dead and read it, it's the opposite again. It's like Dostoevsky is not writing about his inner psyche at all. He's describing what he sees around him. And he does not do that anywhere else that I know of in his fiction. And fiction is all about the drama going on inside your and your conscience and your emotions and your love life and whatever else. But this House of the Dead, he proves what a great writer he is in terms of observing the world around him, the empirical world around him. He studies other people, the criminals, the convicts he was imprisoned with, all from the outside, and then tries to make deductions about their inner psyche. He describes the prison itself. He describes their lifestyle. All this is very different from the Dostoevsky that we read, when we really want to have that powerful emotional and intellectual experience. It's quite different. But
it's
yeah,
good.
like
I read it on your recommendation, and it's a beautiful book. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really something. Here, this is on the left. Yeah, this is the site of the prison. It doesn't stand anymore. It's fallen into disrepair. Yeah, Dostoevsky's prison in Omsk, and these are some that it's sort of like this sort of elemental little exhibit that was put up there. Someone just kind of stuck these pictures there on that side of the prison, which I found very moving. It's human and it's alive. And on the right is the church that I am told, which is where Dostoevsky and the other prisoners were actually taken, when they were taken to a church service. That's outside the prison walls. And he does write about that, House of the Dead as well. But the prison doesn't stand, anymore. Otherwise, I probably would have spent even more time in Omsk. And this is Tukhalinsk, which I'd never heard of Tukhalinsk, but yeah, and it's between it's kind of north of Omsk. It's about 3 hours drive if you have a fast driver north of Omsk, and kind of south of, I guess you'd say, the Tomsk area. I have to look at my map again to get it perfect. But I had the opportunity to be sort of taken out to this town of Tukhalinsk for one reason only. This is a very small, you can see it's a very small town, which, it's hard to imagine anyone would purposely go there. You just pick any town in I don't know, name any towns because I'll offend people, but, a town that mostly people don't go to because there doesn't seem to be a lot more going on there than is going on where you are already. But it did happen that Chekhov did go to Tukhalinsk, and he passed through there and he made a note of it. And so I had a colleague there who turns out to have the same obsession with Chekhov and Sakhalin that I do, and goes on these Chekhov tracking trips every year. It drives to find yet another Chekhov spot. So I love finding people like that. And he drove me out to this town of Tukhalinsk in the hopes that the museum there, which is a little Chekhov museum, would be open and we might be able to see something that Chekhov might have actually touched. And the museum was closed, Those of us who've traveled in Russia a lot know this is not uncommon. You go and it's zakrit, you can't get in. Armont, whatever. So we weren't able to go in. But I just found it, again, it's that same theme that we're building here. The point of a trip is not to go and just see one thing, The point of a trip is to take the trip and experience it and experience the thoughts that you're having about this writer that you're doing a tribute to. There's that Lenin statue. You see a lot of those all across Siberia. And this actually is Tukhala. You can see how old it's, a 17, whatever that is. There's a postal pillar there. It's like a mile.
Is that original? Is that original?
It's a really good question. The thing is made of wood. It's made of wood. So I would suspect that it's kind of rebuilt, but that is the location of it. And this is right, Tukhalin. This is where Chekhov absolutely passed through here, and this would have been a postal station, in the back in the day. In terms of there's something original, it's such a great question to think about. Like, if I've lived in Japan for a long time, and you go to some of these temples are very, very old, but they're made of wood. And so there is a sort of practice in some of these areas to actually take down the temple, the thing, and rebuild it anew. The same sort of architecture, but new wood, So the idea is that they keep it from rotting and melting away, but it actually is not the original. And I think there's something really kind of beautiful about that. It decays like all life on the planet, but if we rebuild it, it will live again. This reconstruction idea, I love to think about a lot. It represents a human tribute to history. This is from Tomsk. Tomsk is a revelation to me. I just absolutely love the city of Tomsk. It's a university town. It's a town of intellectuals. And Tomsk, too, is like Tobolsk. It's not on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And this is very, very important because the Trans-Siberian Railroad comes through and, travelers go through and they pick up, their Skittles or whatever at the train station and they go on to the next place. It's just along the way. But that's not Tomsk. You know, you have to get on a special train and go to Tomsk, just as you do with Tobolsk. And the amazing, and this is these are great scientists. I'm kind of embarrassed. Dmitry Medvedev. Somebody might actually refute me, and if you can put it in the chat. There's a majestic university. So, and then, you know, they have this wonderful chair that you could sit at and pretend that you're just as smart as these guys are. But yeah, but anyway, Tomsk was because of Chekhov, not because of Dostoevsky. Chekhov passed through here, and the funny thing about Tomsk for Chekhov was he did have some things to say about Tomsk. He said Tomsk is a town; it's a filth town. The food is terrible, and it's full of drunks. You know, that's what he had to say. And Tomsk never forgave him for that, which I think is real hilarious. And so this little statue here, you see how funny. And Chekhov attacked, you know, Tomsk as a town full of drunks. And so this statue was put up, Chekhov seen from the point of view of a drunk lying in the ditch. You know, so that's why his feet are so big. It's like the drunk is kind of looking up, and Chekhov's head gets, you know, smaller and smaller as you go up. So I was
it is interesting to read. It's interesting to read on your blog how what Chekhov wrote about many of these cities, and
yeah.
I think coming up soon is Irkutsk, which is one of his favorites.
Yeah, exactly right. And I just think when I went to Tomsk, it just blew me away. I've never seen anything like it. You know, these are these old houses. They're just so beautiful. It's kind of maybe a stereotypical image maybe of Siberia that people have. Yeah, it's full of these wooden houses with the decorated, you know, window frames and so on. But you know, these are original houses left for however many years ago. I don't know. But it's not just these two. It's like they go on and on and on. You know, there's just streets and streets of them. And it's incredible to be sort of immersed in that experience. That doesn't happen anywhere else. You know, I'm thinking now, most of us, if we live in the US, you live in a town like mine maybe, or anywhere else, old buildings are cleared away so we can build nice big condo buildings, you know, and fill their space. But in Tomsk, that didn't happen. And so it's an incredible experience to see this architecture that has kept, you know, has remained over all of the brutal Siberian winters, you know, the call of, you know, economics that says, tear these old things down, you know. And I absolutely attribute this to the fact that the railroad did not go through there, you know. So people didn't bother with it. And I do recommend people to go to these places the railroad didn't go through. So this was one of my craziest adventures. This is Novokuznetsk, where I had Novosibirsk was a base for me, and so you can get to a lot of places from there on the railroad. It's a big hub. So one place I went on the overnight train was Kuznetsk, which at the time of Dostoevsky's life was called Kuznetsk, and that's where he was married. And there's a museum there, purely a museum dedicated to Dostoevsky's first wife. Most of us know the second wife, which becomes a story that you can Google. But his first wife he met when he was in exile in Semipalatinsk, now called Semi. He met her there, fell in love with her. It was somebody else's wife. You know, her husband died, the whole story there. And then her husband moved to Kuznetsk, and he died. And then Dostoevsky finally got to marry her. You know, so there's that great story, and there's a whole little museum there. And one thing I noticed, and the museum was where she lived. You know, this woman that he then married, he married her there in that city. And one thing I think I appreciate most in Novokuznetsk, which I appreciate really everywhere, but particularly viscerally in Novokuznetsk, because it's an industrial town. You know, it's kind of a mining industrial area. And so it's this little island of culture there that I just found very moving, that they're human beings who built this museum and, you know, sort of loving tribute, I guess, to Dostoevsky and basically to culture generally. And a lot of what goes on in these museums, it's sort of credits the author. I say credits Dostoevsky for being a great leader of culture and so on, but the culture also lives. So when I went to this museum, there was an exhibit of children's art there, you know, just local children's art that art teachers had collected and put on exhibit there. So the idea is that the culture is not dead. You know, it's based on Dostoevsky or Chekhov or Tolstoy or whatever. It becomes a cultural center for all kinds of activities, concerts and art performances and also literary readings and so on. So I experienced all that in Nova Kuznets. I had a wonderful experience just being able to take time to think about that there.
That's beautiful. We have a question about Dostoevsky and his impact. They ask, at the beginning of the session, you mentioned Dostoevsky themes of isolation and people encountering inner demons by spending too much time in their own minds. In light of this, what has been the impact of teaching Dostoevsky to your students during and after the pandemic?
Oh, wow. I was really worried that question was going to say, okay, so now are you all demon possessed, from reading Dostoevsky. I think, the isolation was profound, wasn't it, that we experienced during that time? And I think everybody here listening and watching today must have been through that experience, where we just to kind of crumple in on ourselves during that time. And we're desperately reaching out, mostly, of course, through media and Zoom, of course, and all the other media that we consume. But sitting alone in your room and just like having everything go through your little computer is really very difficult for your psychology and your emotional life, And I think all of us probably realized during that time how important it is to have contact with other human beings, real ones, in real space, because we were deprived of that. I think that's very, very important. At the same time, and of course, books were very good for that, right? You're reading Dostoevsky about a character spending all his time alone, and you're alone, in the book. It kind of gets circular on itself. And then you sort of realize, well, I'm not alone, really, because every time we read a book, and not books, but I'm a book person, so I'll talk about that. Every time you hear music, for example, look at art, it's a way of you learning that you're not alone, that there was actually another human being created this book. And I think books go deeper than any other form of art, because they really do go back way down into your psychology, and they make you spend time with the psychology of a stranger, let's say, you haven't met, you get to know the person. So there's something about the engagement that you get through literature that even though you're alone, and you can't really read literature unless you're alone, I think that's built into it, right? Because, hey, if you're with your BFF, you're not going to both get in the other, well, maybe you might, depending on who your BFF is, you're not going to necessarily sit in opposite corners of the room and just read. You're probably going to do something together, right? So we read when we're alone. And I do think that's one of the reasons, like, professors get so crazy, frankly, myself, that we just, we don't spend enough time with other people. We're busy with people in books. So I think that's sort of, as a person who does this all the time, lives in books and teaches them, I'm very kind of sociable, in my time away from books. I'm like seeking out that company. I don't know if I'm moving away from the question. It's a really great question, yeah. Post-COVID, I think we've come to understand how important human beings are. That's really a weird thing to say, but.
Well, frankly, post-COVID, I've wanted to just stay inside with my books. Like, I got used to it.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah, I hear you.
There's one more question, and then I'm going to ask you a final question because we're at time. My final question is going to be, what was your impression of Sakhalin Island when you finally got there? But before we get there, one question: when you visited Russia, how did Russians react to you being an American who is so deeply engaged in Russian literature and culture? Did they find it surprising?
Yeah, I'm super, super lucky because, I know the language. And so that's not that barrier. There's not a barrier between me and the people I meet. I can immediately engage with them. And so that may be a little bit different from a sort of tour that you might take. There's a lot of tours that go through Siberia, and a lot of them are super. I'd like to actually go on one myself. But that fact that I could communicate without a whole lot of bells and whistles, but just directly with people, meant that we could just leap into the really good conversations. A second thing, maybe people were surprised. I don't know. I think maybe people were kind of polite. We got
polite or impolite?
Polite, yeah.
Oh.
Just like, nobody, they're not going to spend time, talking about superficial matters. You know, we're going to go straight to what's really interesting. And people were very, very hospitable. I think that's super important for me to acknowledge that everyone I met on my trip, absolutely everyone, just they took time out. I don't think this happens in the US. You know, you've got someone who comes to your town and someone takes 2 or 3 days just to take you around and talk to you and spend time with you. To me, that was profound. It's a big cultural difference, right? Maybe not 2 or 3 days, but, you know, 2 days, a lot of time out of their busy lives. And I just want anybody, if any of you are listening, to you to know how much I appreciate that, how grateful I am that that gift of time was given to me. I appreciate it so much. Let's see. So in terms of surprise about, well, one thing is that a lot of the people I met were sort of, I got their names from other people. And that was sort of like almost like a chain letter or whatever, where, you know, someone knows I'm doing this and they say, oh, you know, that's why I went to Tobolsk. Someone said, go to Tobolsk. So I did. Well, I would have gone anyway, probably, but knowing a person would be able to see me was very, very important. So there was a human being everywhere. So by the time I met these people, we already had a lot in common. Most of them were Russian literature scholars, myself. And so we could really, really already share an awful lot that we had in common, you know. Maybe a bit of discussion of the books themselves, but mostly our engagement was on the level of the place, because these are people who live there and they know their way around. I think Kazan, I had wonderful sort of person who helped me get oriented in Tolstoy places. Here, and this is the Yenisei River, this is Krasnoyarsk. I also had a wonderful person who met me there, a colleague, and you know, these are great scholars, a lot of them, just wonderful writers about literature. So this would be, hold on a sec, Irkutsk, I guess.
Irkutsk.
Yeah, yeah. You can get a manicure on Chekhov Street. I just love this this advertisement. Chekhov liked Irkutsk. You know, he wrote very. You know, it's actually quite a surprise. You know, Irkutsk is sort of like a joke. I think if you play the game Risk or something, there are these maps, you know, and these places in Siberia are sort of like, oh, send you to Irkutsk, you know. But it was actually, it's actually a very cultured town, and it's a vibrant town culturally, not too far from Lake Baikal. And so, you know, there's a Decembrist museum there. So yeah, Irkutsk is
also those beautiful old houses.
Yeah, Irkutsk is amazing. And then, you know, Ulan-Ude, which I just want to go back. You know, there's this famous Lenin head there. Some incredible food that I had that I've never had before or after. I guess this is Chekhov. Chekhov did go through Ulan-Ude. That's where this picture is. And there's this lovely statue to Chekhov there. He spent a couple days there, I believe. And that's it. But his hotel where he stayed is still standing, and you can get your photo taken there next to him, which usually I sort of forgot to take my picture. You know, I probably should have, but in at least wanted, you know, I got a picture taken. And then, of course, this is the Sivolginsky.San, I believe it's called, outside of Ulan-Ude, and some very kind and wonderful colleagues took me out there. This is a major center of Buddhism. You know, there's a Tibetan Buddhism tradition in that area. And again, it's a temple that continued to exist, you know, through the Soviet period. This becomes interesting, I guess, to historians, and a holy man who's buried there. So it is an important.
I'm sorry. Was Chekhov interested in Tibetan Buddhism, or was any part of his research out there?
Interesting. No. Not that he left evidence, you know, not that he left evidence of. That's a really great question, considering, you know, the impact that places leave on you and the people that you meet in these places. It doesn't seem to have left much of a mark, certainly in his writing. It's hard to say what anyone is thinking, result in experience, right? But about writing about it, he didn't, you know.
Like when you read 19th century Russian literature, you don't encounter this part of Russia.
No, not much, you know. And I guess the other thing is, I don't believe Chekhov went to this place, you know. It was, he did go through on it, but I don't know if he's ever left any record of it. So this was a special gift that my colleagues there in Ulan-Ude gave me. They took me out of this place, which is really just a major center of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. But yeah, I don't think Chekhov went there. And this is the only place I didn't have a host. I went to Khabarovsk. And Chekhov was there for basically a day and a half. He spent the night here in this building. And there's a statue of him. I believe there's another one now. Someone sent me a picture of it. In fact, there's a new statue of Chekhov in Irkutsk that a colleague sent to me that I didn't get in the blog. So I guess the point there is that these cities are very proud of this legacy of Russian culture, and they respect and revere their authors and put statues up to them. And then finally, I did make it to Sakhalin. I was in doubt, kind of like Chekhov, I guess, will I ever get there? And then, what am I going to do when I'm there was another question. But there's a lovely museum there, the Museum of the Book, Chekhov's Island of Sakhalin, which I got to visit. And like these other museums I visited, there's just a loving and meticulous attention to the legacy of these writers. This is the southern part of Sakhalin. I actually cheated. I should just own this openly. Chekhov went up to the north part of Sakhalin on his trip. From Khabarovsk, I got on a plane. There would have been this problem, actually, of how do you get over the water anyway. So you'd either have a boat or a plane. And I thought, no, I'll just get on a plane here. And where you fly is Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, which is where I went. So I spent about a week there, getting the feel of the place and visiting the museum itself. It's a kind of it's kind of an oil place now. There's a lot of sort of oil, whatever that's called, oil rigs or whatever I do with oil. Is that what I do out there in Sakhalin? It's a big business there. And so it's quite a modern city for the most part, at least what I was able to experience. And I did not get to do the thing where you go and visit all the different sites that Chekhov visited. So I did intend to do that on my next trip, which would have been from Sakhalin back east, where I would have visited all the places I missed the first time. I won't say all because there's always more. But then COVID hit, and all travel was out at that point. So I still hope.
You still hope.
Hope to maybe go back. It's hard to say.
It's hard to say. It's this has been wonderful. It took us 98 minutes to get to Sakhalin, and the journey was the best part. It was wonderful talking to you about all of your experiences and how this trip has enriched your life, and I'm sure your students' lives. And I know that you have this wonderful blog where you tell these fascinating stories along the journey, and it's been great. And I understand now you've even recently been visiting other Chekhov places in Western Europe. So that continuing the journey.
Yeah, trying. And it's all part of life, isn't it? It's all not getting these guys out of my head ever. So, the journeys wherever I go are going to carry them along, whether they were there or not. So yeah, it becomes another conversation. I thank you so much, Michael, and all people who've helped organize this and sponsor it. It's really been wonderful to talk to you, and thank you for the people who sat through it. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
It's wonderful. Thank you, and good luck on your next journey.
Thank you. Right about it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.